We sell a lot of M1 rifles here at Collectors Firearms, and a question that we frequently get to people who buy a new M1 rifle is, how do I lubricate the weapon? So I'm going to go through that right now, and to do this, I have chosen this extremely nice Springfield that was made in April of 1945, and it's in original as-built condition. Lubricating a Garand requires a combination of gun oil, but more importantly, gun grease. The major moving parts on an M1 rifle need to be lubricated with grease. You can't use oil for that because the open nature of the action will sling all of the oil off, and no sooner have you oiled the gun than after a few rounds it no longer has any lubrication in it. That's why we use grease. Grease is applied to the significant raceways associated with the operating rod and the bolt. And just to get things started, show clear. I start typically by applying grease inside the raceway here, so that under fire, the operating rod reciprocates to the rear, and there's a friction point along that raceway. So I'll apply some grease there. You can see it quite easily because it's a green color. It's now mostly distributed. I'm going to redistribute some like so. In order to lubricate the M1 rifle, I have to disassemble it. So let's get that done. Now, with the rifle disassembled, we're going to apply some gun grease along this internal raceway here, because this is where one of the locking lugs for the bolt reciprocates during operation. So I'll apply some grease right there. That will lubricate the movement of the left locking lug of the bolt. Right here, which is the channel for lockup for the right locking lug of the bolt, I'll put a little bit right there just for good order. Of course, this area, which is the primary raceway for these lugs on the operating rod, I've already lubricated that, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to put a little bit on, we call that the pad, because that pad locks into the surfaces of that raceway. And without lubrication, it will create additional friction on that pad, which will wear the part down. An important detail is this raceway. This is the area where the right locking lug moves back and forth out of battery during the firing of the M1 rifle. And I'm going to lubricate that because I always make sure there's plenty of grease in there. You don't want to use oil in these surfaces because the M1 action, which is open, it will, as a result of the violence of the operating cycle, it will sling oil out of the rifle. And after just a few shots, you'll have a firearm with no lubrication at all. And that's why we use grease, so that when fully assembled, this locking lug rides in that recess. And it's critical that there is plenty of lubrication there to decrease the amount of wear to the greatest extent possible. One other area where it's important to lubricate the M1 rifle is right here, right on that lower part of the shank, below the chamber on the barrel. And that's because when the operating rod is in position on the rifle and the operating rod recoils to the end of travel, that's an area where there's some friction and contact. So we just put a little bit there, spread it out. With that lubricated, that point of friction will not create additional wear on the firearm. Now, all of these areas have been properly greased. When we use oil in the M1 rifle, we only use it in a few areas. We don't use it much. On the bolt, I tend to apply a little bit of oil in the channel for the firing pin. So I'll just put a little bit in there, let it sink in. That way the firing pin will remain clean. You won't develop any rust that will tend to retard the movement of the firing pin. That's just a little bit of an insurance policy against additional wear. Some people, me included, will apply a little bit of lubricant right there on the trigger mechanism. We have the trigger and its sear, primary sear and the secondary sear. And I'm just going to wipe a little bit of grease along that surface because that is catching the spur on the hammer. And it just makes all the sense in the world for there to be a little lubricant there so that as the hammer moves into the rearward position, it catches, when we pull the trigger, the secondary sear is lubricated. I'm also going to put a little bit right there on the primary sear. So let's get that in. No, it doesn't have to be much at all, just a little bit, since these are areas of surface contact. There. For the good of the order, some people typically apply a little bit of oil right there on the hammer spring. I support that idea. I think that makes a lot of sense. You don't need grease for that because the oil will seep down into the piece the piece that retains the body of that spring. So now our rifle is completely lubricated, and it's time to put it back together. Bolt goes first. So now the bolt has lubrication in the channel for the left lug. There's some lubrication in that locking slot there. So bolt movement is now fully lubricated. I'm going to put in the operating rod. Make sure that fits in the gas cylinder. And when I snap the right locking lug into the operating rod, I'm snapping it into an area that has now been completely lubricated with grease. And now that I have also seated the operating rod into the channels here on the side of the receiver, the operating rod is seated against raceways that have now been lubricated by grease. So everything's nice and smooth there now. The internal components that go in next, like the magazine follower, it doesn't really need anything besides there's a little bit of grease on it as it is now. So I'm going to leave it as is. These other components, they do not need to be lubricated. The M1 rifle will exhibit problems in operation if it's not properly lubricated. And the number one problem that presents itself on the M1 is that the rifle will not eject a clip after the 8th round is fired. That frequently happens. There. Now, the M1 rifle is a complex system, a lot of moving parts in the firearm. And as long as these parts are properly lubricated, as I have just demonstrated, the firearm will work just fine. When M1s begin to exhibit problems, it's usually the result of the rifle not being properly lubricated. It's an extremely rugged and reliable system, but it still needs to be lubricated. And grease is the best way to get the job done. With a properly greased M1 rifle in operation, the rifle will not malfunction. The rifle's wear patterns will be greatly reduced by the lubricant, and the rifle will not just function correctly, but it'll last a lot longer. So always make sure you've got a little bit of gun oil and, more importantly, a little bit of gun grease for your M1.